Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 245, the very last episode of calendar 2021. And today I'm going to talk about the Jimmy Giuffre Trio's album, Jimmy Giuffre 3, or as it's known under its re-release, which I have here, a UK re-release from '67. The original album came out in, I think, '57. The Train in the River, named after the well-known song on the track. And I was always very fond of this particular reissue. My dad had not this one, but another version. And as a kid in late '60s, early '70s, I always remember being fascinated by the little toy trains, and I always wanted to get this particular reissue, which I didn't. Sounds quite nice. Jimmy Giuffre these days is kind of forgotten, I think it's fair to say, but he was between 1946, 47 and 1962, 63, one of the most creative and restless spirits in all of jazz. He was a mainstay of the cool jazz or West Coast jazz scene in the 1950s. He referred to the kind of music he was making with his trios at the time as blues-based folk jazz, but really this is some just lovely, relaxing, intimate music with many different influences, superb interplay between three excellent musicians, and a very rewarding listen. Jimmy Giuffre was born in Dallas, Texas on April 28, 1921. He quickly showed affinity for all kinds of musical instruments. He was giving recitals on the clarinet by the time he was about 9 or 10 years of age. He heads off to the North Texas Teachers College and gets a degree in teaching music. And then in 1942 joins up for about 4 years. The internet is undecided as to whether or not he was with the Army or, as is more likely, the Air Force. He manages to avoid much active service during the war, having basically a musician's brief, and then after the war, he starts to get work as a composer and an arranger for some of the big bands, including Tommy Dorsey. He also got work with Woody Herman, for whom he wrote the big hit Four Brothers in 1947. In 1950, Giuffre moves out to LA, initially to study composition at UCLA, but he very quickly becomes part of the local music scene, and he spends most of the 1950s as a real West Coast jazz mainstay. That said, Giuffre rarely stood in one place for any period of time compositionally, always on the move intellectually. And he played a ton of different instruments. I mentioned the baritone sax, the tenor sax. He also played the bass flute. He played the soprano sax, but he became best known through the course of the 1950s for his work on clarinet, for which he was known for basically playing only in the lower register. In 1951, he started to get regular work with Howard Rumsey's All-Stars, the house band at the famous Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach, along with people like Shelly Manne and Shorty Rogers. In this period, Giuffre really sharpens his compositional chops, writing all kinds of numbers for the All-Stars with Shorty Rogers, including Big Boy, which was the first ever released by the band and is quite a substantial regional hit. He soon tired of the formal musical education he was getting at UCLA, but he continued with private instruction from a guy called Wesley LaViolette, who had been the dean of music at DePaul University in Chicago and had since moved out to USC and had become kind of the dean and the mentor to a whole generation of West Coast jazz players, even though LaViolette himself was not really a jazz guy. He used to say, "I don't really like what these guys play, but I respect it." LaViolette's influence on Giuffre was quite profound, particularly in terms of training him to write in counterpoint or contrapuntal composition, where you have more than one melody line for different instruments happening at the same time. And instead of writing melody lines simply for horns or piano, he also encouraged him to write melody lines for the bass, or sometimes the drums. This became a very distinctive aspect of his composition, and you hear some of it on here. Giuffre leaves Rumsey in September 1953. He spends a little bit of time with Shorty Rogers before going out solo. He's signed by Capitol in 1955 and releases two fantastic records that year on Capitol. One is simply called Jimmy Giuffre. The second, which I debated long and hard about actually reviewing first here, is called Tangents in Jazz, which is a fascinating record. On Tangents in Jazz, what he does is actually abandon the use of chordal instruments like the piano or the guitar. 2 years before anybody else did that. Sonny Rollins, of course, famously does this on Way Out West, but this is 2 years earlier. Then, from 1956 to 1961, Giuffre forms a series of trios. The first trio he forms is with Ralph Peña, the bassist, who had been a bit of a fixture on the West Coast scene for a number of years. He played with Shelly Manne and others. And Jim Hall, the guitarist. Now, Jim Hall had come from Ohio. He'd recently moved out to LA. He'd spent the first year or two with Chico Hamilton, made a couple of pretty good records with Chico, but he and Giuffre end up becoming friends while both attending jam sessions at a club called Sardi's, which used to have jam sessions on Sunday afternoons. Hall ends up staying with Giuffre on and off from 1956 to 1960, and then he goes on to make a really superb set of records with Paul Desmond. With this trio, with Hall and Peña in tow, Giuffre begins to experience a bit of commercial success, really for the first time since the late 40s in his time with Woody Herman, despite the fact that the music the trios are producing is quite quiet and introspective compared to the more dominant hard bop style that was dominating the jazz airwaves around this time. After a while, Peña left the trio, and then Giuffre takes an even more radical step of replacing a bass player not with another bass player, but with a trombone player, Bob Brookmeyer, and that particular version of the trio is immortalized in the film of the Newport Jazz Festival, Jazz on a Summer's Day, where they're playing The Train in the River, the song which, of course, was originally recorded on here. From the mid-50s on, Giuffre also taught at the Lennox School of Jazz, which is basically a summer school taught in this bucolic locale in rural Massachusetts. And it's there in 1959 where he ends up meeting Ornette Coleman, who had come as a student. Giuffre is blown away by Coleman's playing, by his attitude to music, by the whole taking off of the shackles of contemporary musical expectation. And for the next few years, he formed a third version of the trio with Paul Bley and Steve Swallow, which makes a series of albums, two for Verve, Thesis, and Fusion, and then one for Columbia called Freefall, which were really pretty out there in terms of being avant-garde and challenging listeners. And the musical public wasn't really quite ready for this, unfortunately. Maybe wasn't ready for it from Jimmy Giuffre and didn't enjoy much commercial success. And his career then fades away a bit as we move through the 1960s. This record is made on December 3rd, 4th, and 24th, 1956 at Capitol Records Studio in LA, because Atlantic Records didn't have a studio in LA at the time. Not sure if they did ever, actually. The producer is Nasui Erdogan of Atlantic Records. The in-house engineer for Capitol Records, John Krause, is on duty here, and this is the same arrangement which they'd actually had for the Jimmy Giuffre clarinet, which was the previous record which Giuffre had put out on Atlantic. Jimmy Giuffre plays clarinet, tenor saxophone, and baritone saxophone. Ralph Peña plays bass, and Jim Hall plays guitar. As I mentioned, the internet seems to have concluded that Nasui Erdogan was the producer on this. I suspect that actually Krause is effectively the producer, being the engineer on the spot at the time. If it was really important for Erdogan to have been involved, I suspect they would have just flown the trio to Atlantic Records studios in New York City, which they didn't do. Side one starts with Gotta Dance, which Giuffre's liner notes call a short opener to set a happy mood. Gives you an introduction to Giuffre's wonderful tone on baritone, and he also very cleverly has this sibilant effect, which he uses on his sax, to give the same kind of feel that you would get if you had a drummer using brushes. Next is Giuffre's composition, Two Kinds of Blues, which, as you might expect from the title, has a sad blues and a happy blues. The sad blues, played on the clarinet by Giuffre, is achingly beautiful, as is Hall's phrasing on the happier parts. Next is the Hammerstein and Kern standard, The Song Is You, and here Giuffre is on his third different horn in his many songs, this time on tenor. Is a wonderful informality to this performance. Crazy She Calls Me is next. This isn't actually, strangely enough, mentioned in the liner notes or as a song on the record at all, but it is on the label. This is basically a vehicle for Hall, Giuffre accompanying on clarinet, and some very sympathetic accompaniment by Peña on bass. The side ends with Giuffre's composition Voodoo, which I find a little less cohesive than some of the other tracks, perhaps because up-tempo numbers are just difficult to do if you have a rhythm sectionless trio. Side 2 starts with My All, which is a Giuffre composition. He's on clarinet here. His tone is remarkable. It's round, it's full, it's breathy. This is one of the two, I think, unmissable tracks in this whole record. That's followed by That's the Way It Is, which is a big change of pace with Hall on guitar and Giuffre, this time on tenor, really accenting the more percussive aspects of their instruments to make the main riff work. The longest track in the record is next, Crawdad Suite by Giuffre. This alternates a blues with a folk tune, both of which are his own compositions. The blues, I think, works really well. The folk tune lacking a little bit in the melody department, I think. However, the record ends on a high with the song The Train in the River. Here, Giuffre's playing all three horns in different sequence. It's a super lively tune, and through the rhythms and through his playing, completely evokes the sound of train travel, a time when jazz was king. It's a tremendous trio performance and a really rousing finish. This is a beautiful, deceptively simple-sounding record by an ambitious composer who would light up West Coast jazz with his compositions and would then go on to challenge the ears of avant-garde listeners in the early 1960s, becoming very much what you might call an ECM artist before his time. In fact, his records from the early 60s ended up being subsequently released by ECM. Here, most things work, not everything does, but if you think that jazz experimentation in 1956 was limited to people considering whether or not chord changes were necessary, well, here is something quite different but no less creative. It's a great little tangent to add to your 1950s jazz collection. For me, it's 4 to 5 stars.